Today, Alternative Views will interview Pete Bruton concerning his book, The Mafia, CIA, and George Bush. Pete is a former Houston Post reporter who broke the story of the connections between the S&L scandal and the CIA, exposing how CIA assets would borrow money from the S&Ls to finance off-the-book operations and then declare bankruptcy and leave U.S. taxpayers with the bill. Well, for the past 5 years, Pete has been tracking down who actually profited from the S&L scam, who the main players were, and how they skimmed off their money. Lo and behold, Pete discovered that the beneficiaries of the S&L scandals were friends of George Bush and his family, unsavory folks connected to the CIA and Mafia, as well as associates of Texas big shots such as Senator Lloyd Bentsen and Houston power broker Walter Mischer. Well, obviously, this is an explosive story, and today we are going to explore the full ramifications of the S&L crisis with author Pete Bruton, who's now a law student here at the University of Texas.
Pete, this is such an incredible story, one that is so complex, it seems to me almost one impossible to tell, but you do it so well in your book. Before we get into the intricacies of it, I wonder if you can tell us how George Bush himself was involved in this. His family was, but was he himself involved much?
Bush's role was on many levels. First of all, as vice president during the Reagan-Bush years, he was the head of the Reagan-Bush deregulation efforts across the board, and that included savings and loans. And the deregulation of savings and loans that occurred primarily in 1982 with the St. Germain-Garn bill basically opened up savings and loans to the crooks. S&Ls had traditionally just done home mortgage lending to middle-class Americans, and they succeeded very well for 50 years. They had some problems then in the late 70s and early 80s with the inflation, so the Reagan-Bush administration and Congress decided that they were going to deregulate, quote-unquote, savings and loans. And this allowed S&Ls to basically invest their money and lend their money on anything they wanted to, and was an open invitation to the criminal element. And sure enough, the Mafia was one of the first groups involved in looting S&Ls in the early 80s. And the deregulation that Bush was in charge of did that. Bush also, as vice president, either he or his top aides intervened in the federal regulation of the biggest failed savings loan in the country at that time, Sunrise Savings in Boynton Beach, Florida. The CEO of Sunrise went up to Bush's office when he was vice president, and the story varied. He tells one story one time and one story another. He either met with Bush or with Bush's top aides, included C. Boyden Gray, who is the current White House counsel. And he asked them to get the federal regulators off his back. They were trying to stop Sunrise from basically throwing their assets away. And 1 week after he met with these people, the Federal Home Loan Bank Board that regulates savings and loans withdrew a very stringent cease and desist order against Sunrise and replaced it with a weak supervisory agreement. And a congressional study found that this move cost taxpayers possibly $100 million or more in keeping Sunrise open. Sunrise was then closed down a year later, a year and a half later, at a cost to the federal taxpayers of $700 million. And there was no Federal Home Loan Bank Board investigation. It was just shut down. We find if you look at the major borrowers at Sunrise, you find Mafia people, you find CIA people, and you find a Houston businessman named John Riddle, who ties into the circle of Houston businessmen that George Bush comes from. And Riddle, at this time, was involved in the transshipment of arms to the Middle East. Now, the top #2 official at the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, Ann Fairbanks, was in this meeting with the Sunrise CEO when he was asking them to get the feds off his back. Her husband, Richard Fairbanks, was in charge at that time of the State Department's efforts to keep arms from Iran, called Operation Staunch. He quit a year later and became the Washington lawyer and lobbyist for Iraq, and worked with Iraq until Iraq invaded Kuwait. Now, it's interesting also to note that the largest failed S&L in the country that did not have a Federal Home Loan Bank Board investigation, Sunrise was number 2 largest. The largest was Hill Financial in Red Hill, Pennsylvania, that plays a big part in my book. And the number 2 borrower at Hill Financial was John Riddle's buddy, a Houston builder named Mike Atkinson, who at that time was transshipping arms to the Middle East. So you find a connecting thread here of arms to the Middle East and savings and loans. And Bush's office was directly involved in keeping this Sunrise Savings open and was lending money to John Riddle.
Now, we've had on Alternative Views, those of you who've been watching Alternative Views regularly know that about the drug scams which were going on, where illegal arms would be shipped down to the Contras particularly, and the C-130s would be filled up with cocaine and all and brought back in the United States and offloaded, sometimes at U.S. Air Force bases, sometimes at more covert landing strips. Now, how would this operation fit in with what we're talking about?
Right. We found a number of people in Florida that were helping the Contras, taking weapons, guns for drugs, that were involved in failed banks and savings and loans. One CIA gun and drug runner was a guy named Jack DeVoe. And DeVoe was actually bringing in his cocaine into the Ocean Reef Club on Key Largo that was owned by Carl Lindner, the Cincinnati businessman.
Oh, and he's very close to Bush. Very
close to Bush. Okay, Bush would go down and actually vacation at the Ocean Reef Club. And there's a picture in my book of Bush in a fishing boat off Ocean Reef. And this is where Jack DeVoe was bringing in his cocaine. And DeVoe was also taking guns down to Latin America for the CIA. Now, DeVoe's money launderer was a Miami attorney named Lawrence Freeman. Freeman had previously worked for Paul Hellawell, one of the founding fathers of the CIA, and also was laundering money for Santo Trafficante, the Tampa, Florida Mafia boss. Freeman drew up the documents, the sales contract for a 21,000-acre land deal in the Florida Panhandle that Hill Financial Savings, the one in Pennsylvania we previously talked about, and Vision Bank Savings in Kingsville, Texas, that was owned by Walter Mischer's former son-in-law, financed. And here we have Lawrence Freeman drawing up the papers and involved with these people. And he's, closely connected to the CIA, had been the in-house counsel for Castle Bank and Trust in Nassau, a bank that was used by the Mafia and the CIA to hide and launder money, and was shut down when Paul Hellawell died. And it appeared that many of these offshore money laundering operations were moved after Castle Bank failed and was shut down to the Isle of Jersey. And Lawrence Freeman was laundering Jack DeVoe's drug money through the Isle of Jersey. Robert Corson, Mischer's former son-in-law, and Mike Atkinson were laundering S&L money through the Isle of Jersey, along with some people in Colorado that connect to Neil Bush. All were using the same trust on the Isle of Jersey were getting drug money and S&L money, and they were mixed in the same bank accounts.